This presentation is designed to provide an overview of the new IEP in the CT SED system. My name is Leann White. I'm Brookfield's IEP compliance teacher, and I'm hoping that this presentation will be helpful for parents who are new to special education, for parents who maybe are not so new to special education and just would like to see the IEP document broken down piece by piece. So I hope this is helpful. This is a helpful document that you can reference on the ct.gov website. It provides an example of a template IEP. It is blank, so there's no student identification information on there, but you can use that to follow along and see what these pieces that I'll be showing you actually look like in a finalized document. So within this presentation, I'll go through some terminology, walk through the sections of the IEP and CT sets, those that are applicable to all grade levels, and then some additional sections of the IEP that might not be on every single IEP document, such as secondary transition, which is for students who are age 13 and up, amendments, which are supplementary to the IEP, and the prior written notice documentation, which has changed slightly since the previous systems that were in use. So just some general terminology to begin. You'll hear the words IEP a lot throughout this presentation. That stands for Individualized Education Program. The IEP is a document that's developed for students who are eligible for special education and/or related services, and describes the various aspects of the student's educational plan. CT SEDS is the Connecticut Special Education Data System. This is our new online platform. It was implemented by the Connecticut State Department of Education and the Bureau of Special Education, and it's used across school districts in Connecticut. And the Parent Portal. The Parent Portal is an online platform through CT SEDS. It's used for parents and guardians to view and sign electronic documents for their students, and it is separate from the school teacher side of CT SEDS. So teachers cannot see the Parent Portal. It is private to parents. So why was this new system created? The Connecticut State Department of Education partnered with the Public Consulting Group, PCG, in September of 2020, and their goal was to create a new platform, to create a uniform, comprehensive platform that would be used across school districts in Connecticut. The Parent Portal was designed to give parents and guardians easier access to documents, and the overall goal was to improve overall quality of IEPs for students. There are some other great features with the new system, such as improved translation of documents for families. More documents are being translated through the system, and more languages are offered than in the past. And lastly, the new system aligns with a new IEP document that has improved readability of the IEPs for families. So these are the sections of the quote-unquote new IEP. They are in many ways similar to or the same as the sections of the previous IEP, but they look a little different. New information might be included in different areas, and the organization of the document has changed. The first section of the IEP document is our demographic information. It's on our first page. So you can see the school district and a lot of information right at the top of the first page of the IEP, including the student name, what meeting date, you can see over on the right-hand side, the IEP document is referring to, the student's date of birth, grade, and some dates you'll notice here in the middle of the box here. It'll show the most recent evaluation and annual review dates. And then to the right, you'll see the next reevaluation, next annual review dates. And I just want to point out that those are due by dates. So these are not scheduled meeting dates. They are just dates that next meeting would be held by. Right underneath, we have our reason for meeting. So in this case, the example is conduct an annual review or revise the IEP. So that'll state what the purpose of that meeting was. Right below will be listed all of the individuals who attended that PPT meeting. So if the student attends, their name will be on the document as well. Parents and guardians and any school staff members will be listed with their titles. And then additionally, if families choose to invite anyone else to the PPT, those people's names would be recorded as well. The next section is the planning and placement team recommendations. So this provides a summary of any changes that were made to the IEP document, any recommendations that were made during that meeting. So you can see there's as many lines as needed to list all of those recommendations. You might see language such as implement IEP. You might see service information. For example, if a student is receiving 60 minutes a week of reading support, and any major changes to accommodations that might be noted at that time, any other additional information. All right. The next section of the IEP is called Special Considerations. On the document that I referenced earlier on the ct.gov website, there are examples of different drop-downs that open up for each of these different areas if the box is checked yes in any area. So for example, does the student exhibit behaviors that impede learning for self or others? If that box is checked yes, then additional information is filled in to clarify or provide more information about what is being done to support those behaviors. Another example would be if a student has limited English proficiency, so they qualify as an L, a box would open where the team members could write some information about what kinds of supports the student benefits from in the classroom. Now, the next piece I want to point out is the parent input section. Now, this was present on previous IEPs, but it is broken down now into two separate sections. One section for academic, pre-academic, and cognitive achievement, so any parent or student input that's relevant to those areas. And then a second box is available for functional performance. This might be information about things like behavior and communication, social skills, things like that. Now, on the IEP document, these are not side by side. They correspond to the domains that are being talked about, and they are connected with the present levels of performance. So this is what I like to think of as kind of the meat and potatoes of the IEP document. Within the present levels of performance, we have information for each domain that's being looked at. So for example, the domain of reading, there will be present levels of performance, as you can see up here. An overall statement about the student's performance in reading, an explanation of the student's strengths, the concerns and needs, which then align to any goals and objectives, and then a statement explaining how these concerns and needs impact the student in the general education classroom or accessing the curriculum, and therefore why these services are needed. Now, below the present levels of performance in an area, such as reading, you'll see the annual goals and objectives relating to that area. So this is a nice change with the CT-SET system with the new IEP. The present levels of performance are directly next to the goals and objectives so that the areas are together. So you can see annual goal 1. That would be an overall goal relating to reading, improving reading skills. And then below, broken down, any objectives. So typically shorter term skills or scaffolded skills to help reach that goal. And then lastly, below, if there are any related services that support that goal, those would be listed as well. Over on the right-hand side, evaluation method and progress monitoring schedule will tell you how this goal is being evaluated, how it's being measured, and how often data is being presented. So within the present levels, goals and objectives section, there are many domains that are looked at, and this is individualized student to student. So some students may have academic goal areas, some students may have functional performance goal areas, and within those areas, the specific domains are dependent on the student's needs. So for example, within academic skills, you'll see parent input, any relevant goal areas with present levels, goals, and objectives, and those goal areas could include things like reading, writing, math, pre-academic skills, or any other academic skills such as study skills. Functional performance mirrors the academic performance areas with parent input, goal areas with present levels, goals, and objectives. And there's a variety of different functional areas that might be looked at, such as communication, behavior, social emotional skills, executive functioning, fine motor, gross motor, activities of daily living. So again, these would be dependent on the student's specific needs, and not all areas would be present on every single IEP document. One nice change that was made with the CT set system in the new IEP is this extra area called Additional Data Assessment Information, which is located below the present levels and goals and objectives for each academic and functional areas. And this is a place where team members can input evaluation data or any other relevant information that doesn't quite fit into the present levels. And this information carries over from IEP to IEP. We want this information to stay. Because from year to year, it's helpful to look back to the previous evaluation, to refer back to historical information, and that can help to see how progress is being made. The next section on the new IEP document is special education and related services. This is often referred to as the service grid. Now, there's a lot of information packed into this grid, so we're going to break down each piece. Under special education services, you can see the service listed. For example, reading. This refers to reading instruction. Goal ID will have a number or numbers listed below, and those refer back to the specific goals that are listed on the present levels, goals, and objectives page. So you could see this is reading goal number 3. If you were to go back to the goals and objectives, you could align it with goal number 3 to see exactly what's being worked on in that instructional time. The frequency and duration tell you how long and how often. So this is 5 times a week, 45 minutes each time. The responsible staff tells you who is the person who is in charge of this service line. The person who is analyzing progress, typically writing the goals and objectives, determining if any changes need to be made to the program. The service implementer is the person who is working with the student during that time. So these could be the same. In this example, it's special education teacher as responsible staff and special education teacher as a service implementer. They could also be different. So for example, if a general education teacher or another provider is providing instruction during that time, they would be the person who's listed under service implementer. The start date and end dates of these services typically align with the start and end dates of the IEP, with some exceptions. So for example, if a service is ending, the end date might be prior to the IEP ends. Or if it was introduced later, for example, at a review revised PPT, the start date might be later. And another example where these might be different is, for example, going grade to grade, where classes or services look different. For example, changing from a 5-day schedule to a 10-day schedule. We would have to write new service lines to reflect that. So you might see some different end dates and start dates on there. The site tells you the location where the service is being delivered. And you can see, for example, this is 2A. There is a key right below the service grid, which helps you kind of match up those site numbers to an explanation. So 2A is highlighted right here, resource setting. So this tells you that this service is occurring in a smaller, individualized setting, a resource setting, not in the classroom. Instructional service delivery provides any additional information that the team feels is relevant to this service. Similarly, the related services grid also provides information about additional services the student receives. And the different pieces right here are the same as on the special education service grid. So you can see this is an example of a counseling group that is working on a goal number 1. They're meeting once a week for 30 minutes. And the responsible staff and the person implementing the service is the school social worker. The site in this case is the related services setting that refers to the social worker's setting, and it's a small group. Now, one of the changes that Brookfield has been making to our IEPs is clarifying paraprofessional support on the IEPs so that it is clear across grade levels, across school buildings, what kinds of supports the student needs. So one way that is done is by putting information into the service grid. So for example, you can see that this is a service provided during science class 3 times a week. The student has a goal that they are working on during that time, and the special education teacher is overseeing that goal. They are monitoring the progress, analyzing to see if adequate progress is being made. And you can see that the general education teacher and paraprofessional are the people in the classroom who are supporting the student. The site in this case is 1A, which corresponds to the general education setting, 50% or more non-disabled peers, and that's referring to a typical classroom. So moving on to supplementary aids and services, these are typically referred to as accommodations and modifications, or the accommodation grid. Accommodations are changes to how instruction is being delivered, but not what instruction is being delivered. So these are examples of supports that the student might require in the classroom to be successful. Here are some examples below. A copy of teacher notes, extended time, multiplication chart, and you can see the areas where those things are needed. So for example, the multiplication chart is only needed in math class. Modifications are changes to what instruction is being delivered, not just how. So an example of a modification might be changing the curriculum in some way, simplifying tests and assessments as needed, and again, the area and locations are specified, in this case, all classes. The third section is called assistive technology. In this case, here's an example of a communication system, such as a speech-generating AAC device, which the student requires to communicate successfully in the classroom and across settings. Other examples of assistive technology might be things like text-to-speech or speech-to-text. And lastly, there is a section here for adult support. Now, this section is referring to intensive adult support that is not part of the classroom itself. This is specific to an individual student. For example, one-to-one support in a separate classroom or separate program for instruction. So this is another place where we can list paraprofessional support when it is more intensive. The next section refers to indirect services. Indirect services refer to a service that is provided by the special education or related services team on behalf of the student. It does not involve a direct service with the student. So for example, staff members who are working together to support a student, but maybe not working directly with that student. Examples include an occupational therapy consult with a special education teacher, for example, for sensory accommodations, BCBA, so behavioral support consult to team, speech language pathologist consult, or programming of a communication device. So there will be some examples on the next slide. So this is the section. This is how it looks on the IEP document. If indirect services are required, this box will be checked yes, and then any indirect services will be listed below. So here's an example of a BCBA consult that's 120 minutes a month. It's relating to goal number 7, and it's being done by the BCBA. Another example is an occupational therapy consult being done for 30 minutes 5 times per year by the occupational therapist. And lastly, an example of a speech and language consult once a month for 30 minutes by the speech language pathologist. Extended school year, or ESY services, refer to services that are provided over the summer for students who require extra support to maintain the skills that they've gained during the school year. In determining whether or not ESY services are required, teams look at both regression data, which means does the student lose skills over breaks when they're not practicing, and recoupment data. And recoupment refers to if they have lost some skills, how long does it take to regain those skills? Now, this will look very similar to the service lines that were presented on earlier slides for special education and related services. You will have the service listed, the goals, frequency and duration, so how long and how often, who's working with the student. The start and end dates will align with the summer school dates, and any site or service delivery information that's needed as well. The transportation section is a place where team members can document any additional information or requirements for transportation that are needed. So, for example, if a student requires a small vehicle like a van, or if they require special equipment for the van, or even adult support. The removal from the general education environment piece of the IEP document, this can look a little overwhelming. There's a lot of numbers on the page referring to different percentages and hours per week. But essentially what this page refers to is how much time per week the student receives special education services and how much of that time or of their time in the school day is spent with peers in general education settings, for example, classroom settings. An explanation is also provided about the time that's not spent in the general education setting, for example, being pulled out of the classroom, what that time is being used for, and why the student requires that time being removed from the classroom. Again, there are examples on the document that I shared earlier in the presentation. And one thing I want to point out about this page is that if students are receiving a lot of special education support in the classroom with their peers in general education settings, the hours per week may look high, but the percentage of time spent with peers may also look high. So those numbers do not add up to the total number of hours in the school week. They may look like more than the total hours of the school week, and that is okay. The district and state testing information section of the IEP explains any assessments that are provided to the student during the school year and any state testing that is required, as well as any accommodations that the student requires to be successful with those assessments. Any accommodations that are provided during assessments have to align with accommodations that the student regularly accesses during the school year. So you can see in this case, district assessments for reading and math are listed, and the student does not require any designated accommodations to be successful with those assessments. And the team has to follow the policies and procedures of those assessments as well. So for example, if the assessment does not allow for extended time, the student cannot receive extended time. So examples of district assessments are benchmark assessments that are used for progress monitoring. So those are the assessment results that you might get as a parent several times per year. State assessments are determined by the state. For example, the Smarter Balanced assessments, and are completed during a testing window once per year. And as I mentioned, any accommodations that are provided for those assessments have to align with the accommodations the student regularly accesses during the school year. This is an example of a student in 6th grade who will be taking the SBAC assessment for math with the accommodation of a multiplication table. Another example is a student in 6th grade taking the ELA, so the literacy assessment, in a separate setting with text-to-speech. The secondary transition piece of the IEP is not included on all IEPs. It is completed for students who are turning 14 during the period that the IEP will be in effect. So if a student is 13 at the time of their annual review and turning 14 during that year, secondary transition would be completed. This is a way to encourage students to start thinking about and planning for their futures outside of school, to identify the short-term and long-term steps to reach those goals. Secondary transition includes a transition assessment, so tools that are used with a student to help gain some insight into their interests, preferences, aspirations. It includes goal statements, so overall statements about what the student's goals are for beyond school, so post-secondary education and training, employment. Course of study describes any coursework or activities within that school year that the student may participate to achieve those goals. So for example, if a student is very interested in finance and there's an economics course that's offered for their grade level, that might be within their course of study. And then lastly, transition present levels, goals, and objectives. Very similar to the present levels, goals, and objectives that were presented earlier in this presentation, earlier in the IEP document. They outline strengths, areas for need, and specific goal statements to help improve specific skills and reach goals. There is a place for parent input and student input as well. And you can see that visually it looks very similar to the present levels and goals and objectives presented previously. An amendment is a revision to the IEP document. It's made without holding a PPT meeting with parental permission. So these are typically used to correct errors or make small changes to the IEP as needed. The process for making amendments has changed with CT sets. It is a very specific process, which begins with the school staff creating a consent form. The consent form details every change that is to be made within that amendment to the IEP so that the parent can see exactly what is being changed. And then when the parent signs consent, the team can then revise the IEP. And I just would like to note that only the things that are signed for on the consent form can be changed in the IEP document. When the amendment is finalized, a summary of the amendment is shown on the first page of the IEP. And here's an example. Lastly, I'd just like to point out that the prior written notice document has changed from our previous system and is now a separate document from the IEP. So when you access the document in the parent portal, it will not be included on the pages with the IEP. It'll be a separate document. And each action that occurs for a PPT meeting with the IEP process requires a separate document. So for example, when an IEP is finalized and in review or a review revised PPT meeting, a prior written notice document is created separately for implementing or revising the IEP. Another example is when an evaluation is recommended or planned at a PPT meeting, another separate prior written notice document is generated for the action conduct an evaluation. Any additional actions, for example, the PPT denying a request at a meeting, would be documented on a prior written notice document as well. I hope this presentation was helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to the special education team, our director, William Rowland, our supervisor for secondary levels, Doreen Fontana, and our supervisor for the elementary level, Taryn Fainer.